Hello, hello. Welcome to the Heartwood Stream Series. I'm Dan Pierce. Thank you for joining me today. My guest on the show today is none other than Ken Wu. Ken Wu is the co-founder of the Ancient Forest Alliance. He was executive director of the AFA for quite a few years, and that's how probably a lot of you know him who are watching this right now. But he has also gone on to start a new conservation group called the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance. We had a fantastic conversation. I beamed him in from his home just outside Montreal, Quebec. Although he is now living in Quebec, he is an honorary British Columbia resident in my eyes forever and always. Ken has been fighting for old growth forests for just about as long as anyone I know. He's been a tireless advocate for old growth on the coast of BC and across the province, as well as fighting for decolonizing the forest industry and working with the labor movement to try and cultivate a more fair and equitable and just and truly sustainable forest industry in BC. So I'm really excited to share that with you all today. Before we get to that though, I just want to thank everyone who contributed to my crowdfunding campaign. We reached our goal, which is really exciting, and I couldn't be more grateful for everyone who contributed to that effort, and I'm really excited to get on the road and start filming over the next month. Of course, this snap election has kind of thrown my plans into disarray. The plan was originally to get this series out there before the next BC election. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to get the whole series done over the next month. Just not possible. But I am going to be... But, hold on, I'm having a little bit of trouble here. I just want to make sure that this is actually coming through. Okay, good. It is coming through. All right. But I am going to get on the road this October and start filming and try and get something out there over the next month in the lead up to the next election, and which is coming up October 26th, I believe. I don't want to get that wrong. Hold on, let me just double check that. But yes, I'll definitely get something out there before the election, but it's probably going to be small and simple. Make sure I'm not giving you the wrong election date. October 24th. I'm glad I checked. Okay, so that being said, that out of the way, again, thank you so much to everyone who contributed to the crowdfunding campaign. I couldn't be doing this work without you, and I'm so incredibly grateful. And that's about all I have to say for now. And without further ado, I turn over to my interview with Ken Wu. All right, Ken Wu, thank you so much for joining me today on the Heartwood Stream Series.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
No problem. It's you've been on the near the top of my list of people who I've wanted to talk to for this series for the past little while. And then as soon as the election got announced yesterday, I was like, okay, I gotta talk to Ken. He's gonna have some thoughts on what's going on here right now. But before we dive into the politics of today, I want, for those of you who don't know you, I bet a lot of people who are watching right now know who you are. They know the Ancient Forest Alliance. They might even know your new organization, the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance, but not everyone might actually know your history as a fighter for ancient forests in BC. You're actually in Montreal right now, or near Montreal, is that
Yes, that's
correct?
right. Yes, I'm in Quebec now. I spend still quite a bit of time in British Columbia and Alberta for family and activism, but I spend most of my time here with my daughter.
Well, I think you will always be a British Columbian in our eyes, and you're still like the someone who I greatly respect and admire, and I can't wait to get your take on what's going on here these days. But bring us up to speed for those who don't know a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your history fighting for the ancient forests of BC. I mean, you've been on the front lines of probably more old growth battles than just about anyone I know. So, what was your entry point into fighting for old growth in BC? And just give us sort of a little bit of a highlight reel of your career as a forest activist.
Yeah, well, I think there was a big generation of environmental activists in the 1980s who really followed a lot of the work of the Wilderness Committee of that era, the campaigns for the Stein Valley, Mears Island, for the early Clayoquot Sound battles. So I used to just follow the news as a teen, as an adolescent. And then once I went to university, by then I'd been reading a lot of books about radical environmentalism, and I founded the Earth First chapter in Vancouver. And so I was very busy in university organizing civil disobedience type of protests and blockades, and got heavily involved in a lot of those campaigns. The big ones in Clayoquot Sound, which are very inspirational, the Ilaho Valley and the blockades in the north of Squamish by the mid-late 1990s. And then by 1999, I got hired by Paul George at the time, who was running the Wilderness Committee. And I ran the Wilderness Committee as their executive director and campaign director for the Victoria office for 10 years. Then I left that and I co-founded the Ancient Forest Alliance with my friend TJ Watt. And so I spent 8 years running Ancient Forest Alliance as their executive director. And then just 2 years ago, it's actually our anniversary, I then set up the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance, and which has a national focus, but old growth is one, part of the ecosystems of the whole country. So yeah, in this time, I've basically engaged in the full gamut of tactics and learned a lot more to go from tactics to strategies to bigger approaches. But I'm still heavily involved in the old growth campaigns in British Columbia.
Fantastic. In the time that you have been in this fight, can you give me a sense of some of the changes that you've seen over the years? How have you seen the forests changed by logging? How have the forestry laws changed over the years? And how has the fight itself, how has activism changed for you and throughout this movement?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of components to that. So
yeah, so the three were the forests, the laws, and the activism.
Okay, so in terms of the forest, the biggest issue has not been actually the liquidation of all of the old growth, because if you look at the scale of old growth, including especially the low productivity fractions, that is the places where the old growth trees are small, but they're still old. They're centuries old, but they're growing on a rugged mountainside or in a boggy terrain or subalpine landscape or a rock face. There's still a lot of that around, and a lot of that's not commercially valuable. So this is a topic that we should get back to at some point here. But if you look at what has happened, it's essentially we've lost the vast majority of the high productivity old growth in that time. That is the classic forest giant type stands that people think about when they think of old growth. It's the valley bottoms, lower elevations that have been shaved out of the landscapes in the times that I have been involved. I came in the early 1990s when there was literally just a small handful of pristine or unlogged intact valleys left. And now outside of there's probably about 17, 18 at the time, over 5,000 hectares in size of primary and secondary valleys on the island. And now we're looking at a teeny sliver of that, like just small. So we've lost intact valleys and we've lost most of the high productivity, but we still have about 400,000 hectares. So in the forest, we've lost the biggest and the best with a few enclaves and scattered parcels, sort of fragments all across. But we still have some moderate productivity, medium productivity, about 2 million hectares, and then a lot of bogs and subalpine. So yeah, it's the biggest best we've largely lost in that time, but it goes further back. In terms of the law has evolved and changed over time. It hasn't gone far enough, but this is an important thing for especially some of the young activists to realize, is that there's a long history of people pushing that has created gains. And that's important, because if the only thing you can do is to fight and lose, then people do not continue to stay engaged. And so there's a long history of generations of people, millions of people over time who've been in different ways involved in these campaigns to save old growth forests, who got us from literally 2% of the productive forests of British Columbia that were under protection back in 1991, when the NDP came to power back then. And now we're looking at about 11% of the productive old growth under protection. Now, that might not sound like much to go from 2 to 11%. That's about 9% difference. But 9%, of a province this scale, we're looking at the size of European countries. There is progress, not enough. We're going to lose into extinction a whole lot of species like spotted owl, mountain caribou, marbled murrelet, and a whole lot of other organisms on it and start restoring forests. But it's important to know we fought valley by valley and area by area and protected places like the Stein Valley, the Ilaho Valley, the Kutsi-Mateen, the Clendenning, now in Clayoquot Sound incrementally, most of it as a result of a combination of protected areas from the provincial government, which erupted and then resulted because it was inadequate in bigger protests. Then First Nations got control, and now they've got most of the area under tribal parks and indigenous protected areas. There's been huge progress in Clayoquot, and now the whole area is under logging deferral. That is a massive area, by the way, a big concentration of valleys, far bigger than anything else in southern British Columbia for old growth. So there's progress, including where the province is at now. The province is being pushed now to a place where, and this doesn't just come because no one's doing anything. It's because people got engaged on a big scale in different ways through different tactics, writing letters, protesting, calling their MLAs, writing letters to the editor, spreading the word. So that whole process got the NDP, who tried to bury this issue under the carpet when they got elected in 2017, to have to commit then to a public input process. That was a big deal to get them to commit that they're actually going to shift policy. That public input process was overwhelmed by participation, the Old Growth Strategic Review Panel, where people said, we want to see old growth protected overwhelmingly and a sustainable second growth forest industry. The recommendations came out just a week ago, a week and a half ago, and just in time for this election. That's an important point here. And then the province announced deferrals in 9 areas, totaling about 200,000 hectares of old growth. Not enough. On a provincial scale, it's peanuts, but it includes Clayoquot. That is a gem. That is a massive area. Don't let any cynics say that that's not a big deal. The biggest civil disobedience movement in Canadian history occurred as a result of the fight to save Clayoquot Sound and the first tribal parks and massive efforts by First Nations and Indigenous protected areas advocates has brought us to that point. But on a provincial scale, it's not enough. We're looking at a massive area, and the BC government has essentially failed to adopt the recommendations of those of the panel, which are actually really good as a whole, and didn't implement a deferral on the high productivity, the classic forest giants that was recommended by the panel, or the most endangered forest types, or other hotspots. There's hundreds of other more intact areas. And they didn't include conservation financing. So there's a lot missing. We can go over those details, but it's being pushed along so that it's set up now. There's a framework because of the panel and because of the expectations of the province that if we push this low achieving slacker, which is the NDP on old growth, this low achieving slacker with some potential could actually do some good, but it requires the constant expansion of the movement.
I want to jump in at this point and just sort of explicitly state the promise that the NDP made in their 2017 election platform, which was this. I copied and pasted it because I wanted to make sure I got it right. So in partnership with First Nations and communities, we will modernize land use planning to effectively and sustainably manage BC's ecosystems, rivers, lakes, watersheds, forests, and old growth while accounting for cumulative effects. We will take an evidence-based scientific approach and use the ecosystem-based management of the Great Bear Rainforest as a model. So, Ken, have they done any of these things? Have they lived up to this promise in your view? And, what do you think that this era of leadership for the BC NDP, how do you feel like it will be remembered?
Yeah, so they haven't gotten there. They were trying to bury it under the rug. We got them there, by the way. That was, again, a movement organized by Ancient Forest Alliance and allies, including the business community, including forestry workers, including hundreds of thousands of people pushing to get the province to move along and the NDP opposition to make that commitment. Once they got there to that commitment, which is vital because in the Great Bear Rainforest, 85% of the forests are off limits to logging. And it basically put in place the key elements that you need if you want to protect a whole lot of old growth, which is you have to support First Nations economic alternatives. You have to have a science-based targets to define how much of every ecosystem type you have to protect. You've got to have socioeconomic analysis and ways for all the thousands of forestry workers as well to continue making a living. Those type of initiatives are basically what the BC government under pressure have come back around to in theory through this panel, but they haven't committed to those things yet. But we've come full circle from their pre-election platform in 2017 until trying to bury it under the rug under massive pressure to resurface this thing right before the election. And now their stance is basically, well, just re-elect us and then we'll see what we'll do,
Yeah, exactly.
It's basically, it's been largely talking log so far, consultations about the consultations.
Yeah.
They're running more consultations with the stakeholders who previously were consulted as stakeholders for the earlier consultation.
Yeah.
And they want to drag this out, but let's make it clear. This is a big rupture from the policy stagnation that has been there for decades. So this is a big deal. It's not we're not there yet, but the process for all social change is incremental over time. So we get more, we say that's not enough. Thank you for that, but that's not enough. Let's keep on pushing. And it's a large-scale, broad-based movement of diverse people. I want to dispense with this notion that it's a teeny group of superheroes or the most strident bunch that change the outcome. You need those a group of strident people, but the most important thing is to make it expansive in who the allies are. In the big Canadian cities, multicultural outreach rather than just the same white folks. Business community, the unions, forestry workers, the rural working class, religious and faith groups. That type of movement that we've been working to build is the game changer. So that's one of the parts of the evolution of the movement. We can see the evolution of the environmental movement take two different paths. One of them is this idea that large-scale, broad-based, diverse. Another one is that frustrated and getting a lot more narrower. And essentially that's a recipe to lose and the burnout. And you can see this sort of trajectory in different movements around the world where they go.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned that I just wanted to touch on quickly because, every time I bring up the Great Bear Rainforest agreements, I undoubtedly get a few people jump in the comments and say that this was a sellout or that it's not working or that there are gaping loopholes in this. Could you just talk a little bit more about the Great Bear Rainforest agreements and how they've actually been implemented in the years since it was announced and unfurled? It was touted as a big environmental win for old growth. Can you tell me about how you feel about it now, what's working and what isn't in your view?
Yeah, well, let's make it clear that it's not a perfect plan. But if you look at anything else in the Western world, there's no other parallel scale of protection on such a vast region. So the big gains there is that they put aside dozens of valleys, first under order and council moratoria, and then they ended up legislating protection for them. I think it's about 34% of the area that is under legislated protection, provincial conservancies, as well as the older provincial parks. Those are entire valleys, vast areas. Then you've got another layer of forest reserves that were implemented. And that is through the ecosystem-based management approach where there were essentially scientific assessments made on how much natural levels of old growth need to be retained in order to minimize the loss of species and maintain ecological integrity. There's a low risk threshold, the highest amounts that need protection, medium risk, and high risk. High risk is protecting less, and you have a higher risk of losing things over time. And so the low risk option is where Greenpeace and Sierra Club and the Greenpeace, Sierra Club, and sorry, my brain's not working right now, and Forest Ethics were headed, now called STEND, in their negotiations. They landed at the 70% protection levels for most of those ecosystems. It's the southern ones in particular that where there are some loopholes. These are genuine loopholes. There is a component in their negotiations that I think constitutes a loophole that needs closing, and that there were no productivity distinctions. Instead, they use site series. Okay, so basically, what that means, that kind of like meaningless gobbledygook for most people, but for different plant associations, different forest types, the idea was that if you break it down into like 100 different site series, into 100 forest types, that should basically capture a whole lot of the productivity distinctions, whether it's big trees or small trees growing there. And so if you had to represent them all, the idea is that you would end up capturing, most of the big trees as well, with some that had to be open for logging. The problem is that there are some ecosystem types where the productivity is highly variable. You could have, Western red cedar and salal in where they're all stunted and wind blasted and trying to grow in crappy conditions with small trees, or you can have grand, magnificent, some of the greatest forests you'll ever see. If you don't have productivity distinctions between high, medium, and low productivity, basically industry puts a forest reserve on top of the crappy stuff in logs, the big stuff. That's what's happening in areas of the southern Great Bear in particular. But another caveat around that, so that's a loophole, but the caveat around that is that the scale of mandatory protections of forest reserves is so big, especially compared to anywhere else, that it still encapsulates, a good deal, most of that incredible stuff. So as a whole, it's a massive leap forward. It included as well support for Indigenous protected areas and ecosystem-based management and land use planning for First Nations. This is a critical thing. First Nations have been denied the right to participate in the industrial economy for a century, since the time of colonization, except as poverty-stricken lessers for the longest time. And the importance of having an equivalent economic alternative to liquidating the old growth on their unceded territories is a fundamental precursor in order to actually achieve protection. So that is a big missing part of what else is going on in the rest of the province and in the province's policy. If you don't give First Nations an alternative to not log the old growth through these agreements that the province set up, who brokered and facilitated revenue sharing agreements and job employment agreements, joint venture agreements, and tenures for First Nations in some of the most contentious old growth areas, I might add. I don't think that's by accident. Then if there's no alternative, then of course people are people, and you're going to go where the jobs are, especially if you haven't had jobs for the longest time. So it's sort of bad faith, I'd say, is the province talks about how they want to consult with the First Nations here, but they're not going to provide an alternative to the old growth logging path dependency that the BC government set up for old growth logging in those communities. Yeah. So, but anyways, I'm a bit ranting here. Sorry.
No, this is great. Yeah, no, thank you for touching on all this. Yeah.
A lot of details here, but basically, Great Bear Rainforest is a huge leap forward, unprecedented. But yes, there are some loopholes in there. But the rest of the damn province is a loophole. So yeah. I'm not as worried about those particular loopholes compared to the giant loophole, which is the rest of British Columbia.
Absolutely. One of the things that I learned from you, or that I remember you talking about when I first started getting into these issues, and I started asking questions like, well, how much old growth is left? Because the government says this, environmentalists are saying this, and you were the one who kind of originally came to me and was like, well, you see, what the government is doing is that they're lumping in all this low productivity old growth in with the actual prime high productivity old growth and making it out to be that there's actually way more old growth than there really is, and which is actually disingenuous, because what most people are concerned about when they say they're concerned about old growth, it's those iconic big tree ecosystems, and this was all kind of like a shell game that the government was doing with the numbers. And I just got to say, like, one of the bombshell events of the last few months to occur was the Last Stand for Biodiversity report that came out which was authored by Dr. Karen Price, Dr. Rachel Holt, and Dave Dowse. And I swear I've never seen so much excitement about a scientific study in my whole life. Everyone who's involved in forestry issues in BC, just felt like this was a huge vindication, and it really put the lie to the numbers that the BC government had been touting for so long, and really broke down and showed in no uncertain terms what really was kind of like the current plight of old growth and how the numbers were being fudged. So I guess I just wanted to toss this to you now and just say, what are your main takeaways from this last stand for biodiversity study, and why is it so important, and how does it feel for you to kind of like see laid out by some independent scientists, like something that you've been saying for a long time?
Yeah, we've been saying it for decades, but it's actually, they're the first ones who actually, and also the advancement of technology also helps, but we're able to basically do a province-wide analysis and break it down on those site productivity gradients. So it's worth gold, because there's three big myths that the BC government's been using to stave off old growth protection for a long time. One of them is that there's a lot of old growth that's still standing and is protected. That's by mixing in all the boggy landscapes and stunted bonsai trees with the classic forest giants, and then saying, look, there's no issue, there's no problem. It's like saying, because I've got a lot of monopoly money here, I'm a millionaire, you mix your monopoly money in with your real money and say there's no point to curtail spending, let's just keep on going, I got lots of money. Now, there's a couple other myths as well. One of them is around it'll destroy the economy if we save old growth. Totally bunk. And tree planting is we're replanting the trees, so there's no worries. We can deal with those in a bit. But that productivity distinction, basically how good the soils are, the climate is, the precipitation, the elevation, the aspect, all those different things that allow trees to grow big and huge. That's critical for where the big trees are, where the biodiversity is, where the carbon stored, for the recreational potential, for what is actually being lost from the landscape. And it was the Viridian Ecology Report that basically made put those numbers out there. So what they set out there is that there's 13 million hectares of old growth in British Columbia. Out of British Columbia's 95 million hectares of land. Of that 13 million hectares, about 10.6 million hectares is low productivity. Okay, so you hive out 10.6 million out of that 13.2 million, and you're left with 2.6 million hectares of medium to high productivity. Medium productivity is 2.2 million hectares. That's 2% of British Columbia. So that's the places where when you walk there, it's a beautiful forest. You'll have a few giants scattered around, but they're not all over the place like you think about when you go to Cathedral Grove or Carmana. And then there's only 400,000 hectares of the province now that is high productivity old growth. So that's where you see a lot of the classic forest giants. But of that, there's only 35,000 hectares, like a tiny crumb. If you look at the scale of the province, 35,000 hectares, that is the highest productivity class. That is like the valley bottom of the Carmana, the trail to Anderson Lake in the Walbrand Valley, the Cathedral Grove. That does not even register as like 0.1% now of the province. And high productivity, if you include this other high productivity class, just slightly down, then you're looking at 400,000 hectares, and that is still only 3% of what used to be there. They've logged 97% of the high productivity old growth. So the great failing of the BC government's policy announcement recently is that they failed to implement the recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Review Panel that you have to put a moratorium, a deferral on those last 3% of the classic forest giants. If you don't do that, you basically preserved the core of or at least left intact for now. This may change through pushing, which is what we're organizing the campaign for, but left intact for now the core of the old growth logging industry, which is to take that 400,000 hectares, as well as the 2.2 million hectares of medium productivity. So it's sort of like, but instead you have scattered around the province 9 deferral areas. Is an important important thing here, by the way, because I hear people, they protected or they made deferrals in these 9 areas. It's not a big, it's nothing. And then they also protected 1,500, up to 1,500 of the very biggest trees in the province with 1 hectare reserves around them. So that's 1,500 hectares, generally of the highest productivity class, as scarce as black rhinos or as scarce as Sasquatch. There's not a lot of 35,000 hectares. That's 1,500 hectares of the greatest stuff, more than probably exists in the Carmana-Wahlbrand combined, the highest productivity. So these are important steps forward. I just want to tell people that it's important. If you're involved in this movement, you don't try to shoot down progress. You embrace progress, but say you've got to go way further. This is how you got to go further. This is what's left out. But it's sort of like, it's nuts. If sometimes I get a little frustrated when I hear stuff where, like, imagine if we saved the Carmana Valley back in 1994, and then if someone said, "Oh my God, if you look at the scale of the Carmana Valley compared to the rest of British Columbia's 95 million hectares, it's tiny compared to the rest of British Columbia. We don't want it. Take it back." Yeah. This is crazy thinking, right? So embrace progress, recognize it. Let's keep pushing to go further to where we need to go. But totally. Obviously, I'm condemning them for not going far enough.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I want to take a minute now and just talk a little bit more about this old growth strategic review, the report that just came out. It's actually like 3 reports or something like that. It's like over, when you like add the 3 reports up, it's like over 200 pages. I'm not gonna lie, I haven't got through all of it yet. I'm still working my way through.
Well, I haven't actually, these portions that I've actually had to leaf over quickly too.
Yeah, no, totally, right? But I mean, at first glance at this report, I really got to say, it really is kind of just a wish list for what the environmental movement with the forest movement has kind of been saying all along. I mean, they really didn't pull any punches in this report. I mean, they're calling for a full-on paradigm shift. I mean, I never expected to see those words in a provincially sanctioned, review. And these were by 2 foresters. These weren't by environmentalists or Sierra Club people. It was Al Gorley and Gary Merkel who did the review. I don't really know much about them other than they are PFs, registered professional foresters. But
Al Gorley's got to come out on the right side on this issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know them either.
It's Al Gore with a mask on or something like that. But in one of the very first pages of the report, they have a beautiful diagram, and I'll put this up on the screen. But they've got a beautiful diagram sort of like laying out, there's like a diagram of a tree, and at the very base of the tree, under the ground, in the soil, you see the roots, and there's a list of things that are called guiding principles. And some of the things that they lay out here as guiding principles are focus on ecosystem health, use scientific methods, involve the public, maintain local flexibility, foster a paradigm shift, and manage for multiple benefits. The next level up is like the trunk of the tree, and that section is called core drivers. And the main title there is BC Indigenous Government to Government Relationship. And there's a bubble that says provincial policy on old forests and implementation plan and public engagement. And then the next level up is sort of the leaves and the branches of the tree, and they have a whole bunch of what they call products here: compliance with existing targets and guidelines, updated targets and guidelines, address immediate threats, integrated provincial local goals and priorities, updated classification and inventory. I could go on. And then the very top is the outcomes that we want to see is sort of the air, the atmosphere, healthy ecosystems, effective management, public support. And I just got to say, it's like I really can't disagree with anything that they've laid out there. Like they lay out a vision that I think is really, encouraging and inspiring and correct. And, I think it'll be a really powerful tool in terms of, what we need to now push the NDP to actually do, right? Because as you mentioned, it seems like their response has been, a little bit milquetoast in terms of the immediate steps that they've taken. But of course, embracing and acknowledging that, the deferrals in Clayoquot Sound are very significant. I don't want to downplay that at all. I guess, any other takeaways on that report, the actual report as you've read it?
Well, the part, I mean, I like it, right? And it's got a whole lot of, it's fairly comprehensive. It's an overview that includes at least a mention of a lot of the type of stuff that we've been pushing on. What I like is that it also talks about ensuring that there are science-based targets. That doesn't mean much to a lot of people, but that's the critical element there, because a science-based target is not what we have right now in British Columbia. The advancement of the disciplines of conservation biology in particular and landscape ecology over just the last few decades, since the time of the whole forest practices code back in the 1990s, when the foundation for all this was laid, has totally proliferated. And what it shows is that if you don't protect ecosystems on a large scale, instead you have little representative pockets of them, sort of, which is what the BC government's policies have been thus far. Things still go extinct in the islands of extinction. You don't have viable populations. You don't have the whole relationship, predator-prey relationships, the processes, the hydrological processes, evolutionary processes, natural disturbance regimes. If you look at the full suite of what we know of how ecosystems function now, it means that the science-based targets basically crank up the needed protection levels to like around the 70% range a lot of the time, depending on the ecosystem. And right now, we're down on Vancouver Island, I think it's about 19% of medium to high productivity old growth. So basically, if there were to be science-based targets adopted and a scientific panel that would be bringing in the latest science, which is a lot of landscape ecology, conservation biology into the whole thing, then it would essentially nullify old growth logging in the vast majority of forest types. And the beauty of the panel is they know, okay, that process takes time. And of course, there's going to have to be First Nations government to government consultations, which should have been done, by the way, years ago, because that was their NDP's promise prior to the election. And they're just getting started now. But so they know they're going to drag this out.
And sorry, and I did see that there was a statement released by the BC First Nations Forestry Council where they made a statement somewhere to the effect that they were not thrilled, to say the least, that they were not consulted prior to doing this.
They put it on the back end after the other stakeholders. Then
totally.
the government that comes in after the stakeholders.
Seems so like a bungling or a missed opportunity, a misstep on the part of the government there.
Yeah, but the great thing about the panel is it makes the recommendations for interim measures along with the long-term and medium scale. They have different time frames, and it's well done. And what it is it's a standard then, a set of expectations to hold the province to, because the province hasn't committed to these recommendations, nor in the 3-year time frame that they recommend. So my prediction is basically this, is that the BC government is always looking for ways, including the BC NDP government, which is essentially the status quo, but they're pushable. Unlike the BC Liberals, who are harder to push, the BC NDP are worried of their vote migrating to the Greens. But in their standard resting positions to try to preserve the status quo of old growth logging, largely for steelworker union jobs, right? So they are trying to figure out a way to drag this out as long as possible. They're going to consult the stakeholders about the recommendations from the previous consultation with the stakeholders. Then they're going to start on a round of First Nations consultations, and then they're going to have high-profile deferral areas, which is a good thing, and some of the biggest biggest trees in the province, but leave most of the 400,000 hectares that is the core of the issue, the logging of the high productivity, open for logging in the meantime. So it's a talk and log at its core. It's consultations about the consultations. And it's basically a way to say, re-elect us. Now we'll see what we're going to do. We come into the next election, they will drag it out further. Mm-hmm. Well, this pandemic, it turns out it's taken a year longer. It's hard to talk to people. The vaccine's just being deployed here. And, they're going to find some way to drag this out as long as possible. And time is everything. Mm-hmm. Because in the end, when they say justice delayed is justice denied, there's no place that's more true when it comes to the fate of endangered species, ecosystems, 1,000-year-old old growth forests where we don't get them back. It's forest mining, right? Because rotation is 50 to 80 years. No one's waiting 500 or 1,000 years.
No. One of the regions in which people are kind of feeling the most jilted or forgotten about, ignored by the steps that the NDP, these interim steps that they've taken, is the interior of the province. And there is a lot of old growth in the interior wet belt that is still being targeted for logging. A lot of it is prime, critical caribou habitat. Can you just sort of give us a sense of, your organization now is the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance, and we've got an iconic species like caribou that in many places is teetering on the brink. We're seeing local extirpations of different herds of caribou, and we've got a government that has sort of like taken the stance that its primary response to the crisis is to shoot wolves, to scapegoat wolves, while at the same time continuing to log critical caribou habitat. Maybe you could just pick up the thread from there. Tell me what's going on in the interior right now and what needs to happen there.
Well, the inland temperate rainforest is actually the first rainforest I got to know, because when I was living in Calgary as a youth, we would do trips to British Columbia, and I would marvel at the giant cedars trail in the Mount Revelstoke National Park along the Trans-Canada Highway. And then subsequent times I explored in the West Kootenays, different ancient forests, a place called the Singing Forest back in the 90s, which got logged. And these are spectacular ecosystems as well. We went to a grove, TJ and I, so my friend TJ Watt, who many people have seen the photos, called the Parthenon Grove, east of Prince George. That is just so mind-blowing. It goes on and on and on. Some of the greatest ancient cedars that you essentially don't find that on that scale on the coast anymore, except maybe in Clackwood. But I haven't even seen a grove like that on the coast. That is pure cedar for that much, and giants. And it doesn't have the fame of the coastal forests, nor does, mind you, other interior old growth forest types. Old growth ponderosa pine is an amazing, fragrant, gorgeous forest. Old growth interior Douglas fir. All these inland old growth forest types are incredibly endangered and need protecting. The BC government did put a deferral on the Incompleloe Valley, which is just south of Glacier National Park area there, but it didn't do anything for the northern inland temperate rainforest, nor for the dry forest types in the interior where there's old growth. And yeah, I mean, the important thing is, one reason I wanted to set up a group called the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance is that much as I love these ancient cathedrals, old growth temperate rainforests, I believe that all native ecosystems, from prairie grasslands where there are no trees or almost no trees, to deciduous forests of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence, to the beautiful aspen parkland ecosystems, the transition from grassland to boreal, the dry ponderosa pine are all have their own intrinsic value as important as old growth coastal temperate rainforests, but they don't necessarily all have the same risk levels of risk, mind you. Grasslands are actually the most endangered, but the old growth panel's reports recommendations was based on ecosystem types, and so they said if less than 10% of the original old growth in an ecosystem exists, then there has to be an interim measures, a deferral. And the BC government couldn't even do that. They would not even commit to, when you have 1% of old growth coastal Douglas fir left, when you've got about 2% maybe of the dry maritime forests, so that's like places like Coxsila, slightly inland from the coastal Douglas fir zone on Vancouver Island. Those are natural areas where there need to be deferrals, and they wouldn't even do that. So, it's a frustrating thing. Based on ecosystems and productivity, the heart of where the biological diversity is, they've left out from their deferrals and their protection measures so far. And that also includes, of course, the inland temperate rainforest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. In the time that we have left here, Ken, could you sort of lay out what are your top priorities, or what do you feel like should be the top priorities for this movement in terms of the kinds of policy changes that we need to see in forestry? Outline an agenda for me, and I know some people ask you, what is your one demand if you had to pick one thing, but I know it's not one thing. If you could sort of lay out the laundry list of things that you feel like we need to change and what the priorities are. And yeah, we'll just start with that.
Okay. So the besides building a broad-based movement to push right here and now to get deferrals, because the deferrals are really important in the high productivity ecosystems and most endangered ecosystems. And that broad-based movement needs to include businesses. It needs to include forestry workers, needs to include unions, needs to include a whole lot of different kinds of people here who normally are not taking part in these movements. We spent a lot of time at Ancient Forest Alliance building those movements to secure support through chambers of commerce and restaurants and B&Bs. And that kind of work needs to continue. Also making the alliances with forestry workers, because it takes backwards the movement when you don't work with communities who can have a good future through value-added sustainable second growth forestry. It's not a no forestry position at all. So we need to get those deferrals, and we need to push for the implementation of all those panel recommendations in the slightly longer term, because there's not a lot of time left. An actual science-based legislation with targets for all ecosystem types from the province, but also in the more immediate term, besides building that movement, pushing for those items, is First Nations conservation financing and support for Indigenous protected areas and First Nations land use plans is the vital game changer, and to actually get legislative protection. There's no way to save old growth in this province, which is overwhelmingly the unceded territories of many, many First Nations, unless there's an equivalent economic alternative for First Nations to move towards. Because all across the province, First Nations have a vested interest in the old growth logging industry in different ways, through revenue sharing and joint venture, employment agreements, tenures. And that's not their fault. Obviously, there's a need for employment and revenues, and they've been denied it for a long time. The BC government, successive BC governments, have created that path dependency. Now they've got to create the options so that they can build economies instead based on tourism, ecotourism, cultural tourism, non-timber forest products, wild mushroom harvesting, clean energy, like the Souk First Nations has been building the eco-certified seafood harvest, a whole variety of different value-added second growth forestry, sustainable industries, so that it's also there, you can have an economy and the protection of old growth forests at the same time. That's a critical piece, conservation financing. The federal government, by the way, is supporting Indigenous protected areas, but they're not financing old growth particularly. So what's happening is all the financing for Indigenous protected areas is going into the Arctic, subarctic, alpine, and subalpine, basically places without the timber value. It's the classic, basically. And I like this. It's good to see tundra and subarctic and muskeg protected. Those are native ecosystems too. The scale of the threat to most of those areas far lower than in the southern landscapes of Canada. Grasslands, old growth forests, deciduous forests. They need to earmark a subset of the federal Indigenous protected areas financing, the Canada Nature Fund, for old growth in particular. Okay, so that's financing for First Nations. There also has to be a land acquisition fund for private lands. On eastern Vancouver Island, in the whole Port Alberni area, McLaughlin Ridge, Cameron Firebreak, the Horn Mountain above Cathedral Grove, part of it which just got logged, Coxsila near Shawnigan Lake, those ancient forests are on private lands. There's no way to save those areas unless there is money to actually buy the lands. And conservation groups don't have the money for that. So there's got to be a land acquisition fund. And there's got to be support for the tens of thousands of forestry workers. It's important for activists, I think, as well, to know that our activism doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not just yelling the purist position will change the outcome and eventually getting more and more strident and frustrated because you're not getting what you want. It means spending time to build diverse movements, including among forestry workers. We build alliances through Ancient Forest Alliance, and previously when I ran Wilderness Committee with thousands of forestry workers and the PPWC, Pulp Paper Woodworkers of Canada, back in that time now, they're Public and Private Workers of Canada, and the Yubo Timberless Society, and at different times with the communications, energy, and paper workers, and steel workers, even at certain times, on raw log exports, on to stop increasing privatization, private rights on Crown lands and First Nations lands, and to save old growth, because a lot of the mill workers and forestry workers came on board saying, you know what, if we're going to rely on the diminishing last stands of old growth forests and not push for an actual agenda to crank up a sustainable value-added second growth forest industry, our jobs are going to be gone. And that's essentially what's happening very quickly now. So yeah.
I just got to jump in and say I'm in full agreement with you that in terms of building alliances between the environmental movement and the labor movement. I think that would be a force to be reckoned with. You know, I get a lot of comments on my page, on my Heartwood page, from people working in the forest industry. You know, some of them are just ad hominem attacks, calling me a communist or whatever. But I really try and engage with everyone on my page, especially people in the forestry sector, to like ask some questions and hear what they think, but also to try and like articulate, you know, common ground and areas where we actually have shared interests. What do you say to people in the forestry sector who, you know, are afraid that any sort of like legislative changes in favor of the environment will negatively impact their jobs? And yeah, what do you feel is the common ground and the shared interest between the environmental movement and the labor movement? How do we strengthen those bonds and that sense of solidarity?
97% of the high productivity forests, the best growing conditions for forests in British Columbia, are second growth now. Over 80% of the medium productivity old growth. Now, I'm not going to be talking about productivity distinctions when I'm talking to the average person, but okay, it's most of the best forests are second growth now. And we need government incentives and regulations, incentives like PSD relief or rebates for investment in second growth manufacturing facilities. Research and development as well. For example, you can replicate red cedar, by the way, the qualities that stem decomposition if you thermally treat pine. We have huge tracts of lodgepole pine in the interior, and you can thermally treat that like the Europeans and New Zealanders do to exude the resins from the wood, and then with no food inside the wood, basically the bacteria and fungi can't eat wood, and you can use it for outdoor cladding then. But you can do that with like 80-year-old lodgepole pine instead of 500-year-old cedar. The government can take a proactive stance and actually show some leadership to build an alternative that keeps people jobs in forestry specifically, and to bolster forestry employment even more, especially on the manufacturing side. So we can do basically what every other Western jurisdiction is doing. It's not like the rest of Canada. If you go to Ontario, Quebec, where you got massive forest industries, they're not logging 500-year-old trees. Their industries are almost as big as British Columbia. Well, at least Quebec is massive where I am. And you know, these southern boreal landscapes are very different.
And they get like twice as many jobs per 1,000 cubic meters cut than we do in BC.
There's more manufacturing, there's more jobs. And so there's a win-win here. We can do what everybody else does. We don't need to cut. It's sort of like saying, in order to preserve jobs, we're going to have to harpoon the last of the great whales or slaughter the last herds of elephants. Otherwise, we'll have no meat. We'll have no jobs. Right. Who takes that stance?
And then it's like, and then what? And then once they're gone, then what? Like, we're still going to be in the same position. So it's like, you know, either we willfully and thoughtfully and strategically pull up now and save some of what's left and have, you know, a softer landing, or we just, you know, keep doing what we're doing until we like dive bomb into the ground. That seems to be the choices that we're faced with. I mean, the other thing that I like to say to people is just that, like, okay, over the last 20 years, we've been logging old growth, and we've still seen 40,000 forestry jobs lost. So whatever we're doing right now clearly isn't working. And, you know, I'm in agreement with you. I think that, you know, doing more with less, actually developing and building a local value-added processing industry, doing more with the wood that's harvested, you know, actually breaking up some of the big corporate tenure holders and allowing small milling operations to actually get the wood that they need when, you know, a mantra of Ray Travers is the right log at the right place at the right time,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and that's kind of what's needed. And right now, mills just can't get the logs that they need to thrive and survive. So anyway, I'm really interested in exploring that more. But before we run out of time here, Ken, tell us about the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance, and like why this shift, and what are some what have you got on your radar with your new endeavor?
Yeah, so we just turned 2 years old actually. And yeah, I'm pretty excited to have a new organization, a national organization. As I mentioned, I want to see the science-based protection of the great diversity of native ecosystems around the country, from grasslands to old growth forests in British Columbia, where people still see me operating, but also working to save deciduous forests and all types of ecosystems based on science. Again, a big game changer is support for the Indigenous champions of tribal parks and other types of Indigenous protected areas. So we're working behind the scenes on different initiatives related to that to ensure government financing. And I really believe I want to make a revolution in the environmental movement. Yeah, because I remember seeing a cartoon long time ago, which is the rapidly evolving world of environmental tactics. And it was like 1970, and a guy like chained to a tree, shivering in the rain. 1980, a guy chained to a tree, shivering in the rain. 1990, a guy chained to the tree, shivering. Okay, so the basic idea here, it's always the same people doing the same things. I think the evolution of the movement is that two things. One of them is it's got to show that environmentalism is not for the needs of other things or their children's future, or polar bears in the Arctic in 2100. It's to meet their needs now. It's for their health. It creates a more resilient, diversified, prosperous economy if we protect areas. That's been shown through all the research. And it's also a matter of survival. But it meets our needs now, the agenda of the environmental movement. And that is a bridge to the expanded awareness, ultimately where we need to go, which is a biocentric ethic on the diversity of living organisms. But to get there, you need a bridge. Talk about how it benefits people now. And secondly, organize a movement that mimics that. So again, it's a tiny diminishing group of more strident individuals on one side, and then you have a model which is to diversify, to build movements that include labor, include businesses, include faith, include multicultural outreach in the big cities, and of course supporting Indigenous protected areas and Indigenous rights. Is a huge foundation of it all. That's kind of where I want to take it, but it's
Yeah.
just a small number of staff right now, but we're growing. So.
Cool. And Ken, I know you're out of time here, but I just want to end with one last question for you here. I'd be remiss if I didn't kind of like mention the fact that a snap election was just called yesterday here in BC. I know I'm having to sort of like figure out how to reshift my focus. My plan was to just go out and shoot my documentary series that I had just done a bunch of fundraising for, and now I'm kind of like, well, is that really the best use of my time? Because okay, we've got a month now, we're in an election season, and if we're not fighting for power, if we're not fighting to get the policies that we want, then what are we doing? We're just shouting into the void. So here in BC, as we enter into this election season, what are your thoughts on how we could best leverage this moment? And what do what can you say to voters and as well as those who are out here fighting for forests in BC to get forestry on the agenda this election season?
Yeah, I would basically point out that the NDP's promise was to bring in a Great Bear Rainforest, a model for managing the old growth across the province. They haven't done that. They haven't committed to the panel recommendations that actually are very similar to what the Great Bear Rainforest is. It's a broken promise. They've dragged it to an election. They've got to be held accountable for that. We can take it to the right place, but in terms of accountability for this election, the NDP have grossly failed us on the old growth issue, and they need to be held accountable for that. Now, also the BC Liberals, they were fairly anti-environmental party on the old growth issue for the most part. And the Greens, they are taking the right stance. I'd like to see if they're going to raise the issue more around old growth. Obviously, there's a small number of individuals. Old growth comes up sometimes with them, but it hasn't been central focus. But yeah, I mean, at this point, I'd whatever your friends and family get people informed about where things are headed. There's a giant loophole that allows the biggest and best to be logged, but they're starting the movement in the right direction with at least the first 9 deferral areas. And they made a promise. They haven't kept that promise. Let everyone know that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the general sense from what I've seen on Twitter these days is that people are seeing this snap election call as a pretty cynical move. I took a look a couple nights ago at what were the ridings where the Greens came a close second to the NDP, and the Liberals were a distant third. And I'm really hoping that they're able to flip a few of those seats that they weren't able to get in 2017. Maybe the Greens come out in a slightly stronger position this time around. I would still like to see an NDP minority. Obviously, I don't want to see the BC Liberals come into power or do anything to make that happen. But I think in those key ridings where the Greens are competitive and where it was a close call last time, I would really love to see them flip a few of those seats and maybe just have a slightly stronger position in the legislature this year with Sonia Furstenau at the helm. I think that would be really exciting.
Yeah, honestly, the best scenario for the environment, if you look at around the world, it's usually social democratic governments with Greens. Greens haven't been strong enough to take power, right? But when you get that combination, is normally when you get the most progress. And in this coming election, it's basically southern Vancouver Island. It's about 7 ridings on the South Island where the Liberals are far behind. It's a contest. What an incredible part of the world, by the way. The contest is between socialists versus environmentalists. That's the main battle, which that's not the reality across the rest of the country. You might only have a few, like Portland, or a few places where that type of scenario. But on the southern Vancouver Island, that's the main contest. And if there are 5 or 6 Green seats holding the balance of power, holding John Horgan accountable, that I think could be rocket fuel to get old growth protected. If the NDP end up with a full-on minority, it's going to be a slog, I would say, on the old growth issue. And certainly the BC Liberals, are basically the worst on the environment. So.
Yeah, well, I'd push back a little bit on the notion that the NDP represents socialism. I think they've, maybe proven themselves to be a little bit more center-left over the last 3.5 years, but I feel like that's a conversation for another time. Ken Wu, thank you so much for joining me today on the Heartwood Stream Series. I thought it was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me. Right on.
Cheers. And I'm back. Thank you so much to Ken Wu for talking to me. Covered a lot of ground. So much going on right now in BC forestry. And you were a big help in helping to put some of those things into perspective. Not much else to say today. Again, thank you so much to all of my funders who contributed to my GoFundMe campaign and helped me reach my goal. It's going to allow me to hit the road in October and start doing some filming for this new web series all about logging in the interior. And with the election coming on October 24th, obviously, not going to be able to get the whole web series done before then, but I'm going to try and get something out before the election. Probably be something short, snappy, punchy, kind of election ad style. But I want to make sure that I do something in this moment that speaks to forestry as a core issue that needs to be considered this election season. So that's it for today. Go check out the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance. That's endangeredecosystemsalliance.org. I'll put the link in the comments. And thank you again to Ken Wu for talking to me. And I will be back next week. Thank you so much.